that point in time, there are basically 3 or 4 people in the United States going down anything like that. He's definitely one of them. And he just somehow, he goes straight to the deepest pit in the state. You know, I don't understand how the man did that. But he's had a charmed life, and I think you would agree. And one other thing as we close here, because it is time to move on to the next session. There's a personal side to this, as I'm sure all of you know, that we can talk about for hours and hours, and probably some of you already have and will tonight. But people like Bill and some of the other folks that are in this room, I really think of as modern day heroes. They are people who would not take no for an answer. They had determination, they had enough ability to pull it off and do it safely and not kill themselves or someone else. And I think, you know, eventually when we tell this story completely, and I don't know that we ever will, we'll look back on people like Bill, Tank, Roy, Tom, and recognize these people as real heroes of the 20th century, because they were the people who had not only the nerve and the ability to do it, but they had the patience to bring along snotty-nosed kids like me and Kirk and some of the others here, and let them do it too. So it's really been a fun thing. It's been a real privilege and a blessing to know him and to know many of you. And the last thing I'll leave you with is this: there's no cave or pit that's more important than any life in this room. Be careful. We've lost some people this year. You know, I think of Dick Graham, I think of some of these others, and we don't want to lose anybody. So no cave or pit is worth taking a chance or getting hurt or killed. So just be careful, but keep on trucking. Okay? Thank you very much.
But what I thought I would do is run through some of the problems we had and beginnings we had in the first Tennessee Cave Survey, and finally wrap up and see where we are today. But the notion of a survey of Tennessee caves in some sort of book or compendium is about as old as the Grotto. It was first presented to me in the winter of '52 by W.D. Hardeman and Bill Hardeman, the state geologist in Tennessee, when he just asked what it might take to do a book with descriptions of Tennessee caves. And of course, nobody knew back then. The closest model I had was Bill Davies' book on West Virginia, which had come out in 1949. And you may notice some resemblances in the final product of the book I wrote in '61, if you compare them closely. But essentially it was about '52, I guess, when the germ of the idea was formed. And we began field work mainly with Bert Denton and me in 1953, and then Roy and others came on board later. The results of the survey were finally published in the fall of '61, so we're now 42 years since that event. And it makes me feel like the old graybeard I now am. I went down to the Christmas party in the '70s sometime. Roy asked me down. Everybody said they expected to see an old graybeard. Well, I accommodated the beard a few years later, and getting old, I have no control over it. I had been in the NSS, I guess, 4 or 5 years before all this started, with a low number of 892 or something like that, which seemed real high to me back then, because tanks, I think, was 400 or so. When I met Don Black, he's down in the hundreds somewhere. But there was several cavers from Hillsborough High School joined me for a while there, including Don Ball, who met in an unfortunate accident, as you're aware, in Cumberland, what's now Cumberland Caverns. during his senior year there a couple of years later. I had gone on to Harvard and would come home on summers and work on going to caves and whatever. One Christmas vacation, Bert and I had planned to meet Don Ball and Tommy Shriver and Vernon Sharp, I guess, down at Higginbottom Cave, as it was then called. And when we arrived, and they had gone the day before, when we arrived in town, we heard news of somebody's trapped in the cave, so of course we rushed out. And we met the rescue party coming down the ladder in the historic section. And from then on, it was just downhill with Don, and he died a couple of years later. So early on, I was aware that there was a dark side to caving as well as the pleasant side. But in high school, I developed a strong interest in biology from year one, and it merged with interest in caves. The cave interest, as far as I can think back, happened about 1938 when my parents took me to Mammoth Cave, and they had a little slick publication back then called Caverns of Enchantment, which we bought a copy, and I took it home and drooled over it for years afterward. The notion of cavers going to remote places that nobody had ever been. And for years after, my mother told me that she would go around telling everybody they had to hold me back from jumping into the bottomless pit and other such stories. Actually, it was Lover's Leap, and I could see the steps going down. Actually, eventually I did go down there, but it wasn't bottomless at all. I suppose if bottomless pit were truly bottomless, you wouldn't worry about falling into it. It's the bottom that gives you the problems. Well, there were stirrings of Boston and beginnings of Boston Grotto about then. And a couple of years ago, they had a 50th anniversary, and somebody kept bugging me on email for things I remember, and I couldn't remember anything much about except miserable little caves. The biggest cave in Massachusetts, Eldon's Cave, is about 140 feet long, and it's pretty because it's in a marble with blue bands in it, but you're crawling through 45-degree water, and you have a shower bath of cold water all the way through the cave. So it's no fun. The boys on the trip enjoyed watching the girls go through, but it was a very enjoyable trip, although memorable. Similarly, Twin Lakes Cave I had been in very early on. I may have been even in high school by then, and this was the huge cave in Connecticut. And so from descriptions, I envisioned a huge pit, with ropes to hold on to, climbing down and so forth. You get there and you just walk in a little room and that's it. So I was disabused about some caves in the Northeast anyway, for early on, in contrast to those that I've seen in Tennessee. In '53, at any rate, there were enough cavers to organize the Nashville Grotto, as you're aware, and Roy and Tank and Kenny and some others, and I began that. But it was also the year in which the first field work for the Tennessee Cave Survey began. And Bert and I started out by visiting all the commercial caves. There were about 6 of them at the time. Bristol Caverns, and the cave near Sevierville was not open at the time, and the one at Atomic Caverns or Grand Caverns was not open. Indian Cave was open up in Granger County, and of course Jewel Cave west of Nashville. Then we began looking around in other areas. We had a lot of help from cavers, volunteer work all around the state, but notably, I might mention from the remnants of the old original Cumberland Grotto, which was based in Tullahoma, not in Cookville. And they had Cordlink and Dan Bloxham were the most active, I suppose, there. If I leave anybody out, Roy's up here to remind me. In Chattanooga, we had Leonard and Barbara Munson, Don Black, and his brother-in-law, and other members of the Chattanooga Grotto from time to time that helped considerably in filling in information gaps in that part of the state. And of course, Bill Cuddington moved to Nashville for a while, and anytime we'd find a pit, we'd just make a note and say, well, tell Bill. And Fritz Weitzel, professor at the University of the South in Sewanee, participated in a lot of our work. We camped in his backyard several times, as I recall. And up in East Tennessee, Powell Foster and Clark Johnson were very active. It speeded up finding major caves in that area of the state. And finding Jack Gibbons was at UT at the time. And Jack recently, most recently, as you may know, was Clinton's deputy advisor to the president on science. And when he was appointed, I sent him a little note of congratulations, reminded him that he had helped out in the cave book by contributing maps of Bull Cave and a couple of other caves, and he remembered it very well, not surprising. And sent me a little note back on White House Station area and said he got to see the vice president every day. And I don't know whether he ever saw the president or not, but at least his office was there in the White House. So we had a number of other contributors. Charlie McCurry and Ed Davis had worked for a while. Bill Stewart and Dickel. Both Charlie and Bill eventually went into geology careers. And if I left anybody out, because I left Roy out. That's why he's up here on the podium. Roy was at 53. We added you down in there. I remember we had Bert's. For a while, Bert had a huge old red Chrysler convertible, and it had big air horns on the side, so long. And the trouble with that was any cops would see you riding along in that car, and they would just automatically stop you and figure you had to be doing something wrong. It got us there for a while, but eventually we got the old 1950 state truck from the motor pool, and there's a picture of that floating around here somewhere. A lot of times we just had to ask. The most productive way was to find caves. The most productive way to find caves was to sort of look at the county geography ahead of time. You found particularly the major creek valleys, places where people would live out in the country. And then you go down to the courthouse square on Saturday morning, and you line up all the wigglers sitting around on the benches and just make your rounds asking about caves. And we made an effort to try and find somebody on each of the major streams. And if not, ask them if they knew anybody over on such and such a creek. And that way we could sort of cover the area pretty well without leaving the courthouse square. I think using that method, in about an hour and a half, we picked up 30 leads in Sparta alone. And depending on the density of caves in a particular county, it usually worked pretty well. I should mention that the Tennessee Valley, we did have 7.5 minute quads available, but most of the Cumberland Plateau, and except for down in the Elk River, Tennessee River Basin, was the maps were either old 30-year-old, 50-year-old ones, 1890s or something like that, 30-minute quads. So you can imagine how much change there had been in the roads and the culture and everything else. And in a few favored places, we did have 15-minute maps, but even with those, it was difficult to pin down precise locations. Some of them that we had to use were incorrect in the book. In fact, we got one in the wrong hall in Jackson County. County. For lighting, we generally use carbides or gasoline lantern. If you could walk through the cave or crawl or whatever, the gasoline lantern gave me at least a better view. I got that notion from Burton Faust, I guess, from the old DC Grotto. And carbides were, of course, more mobile when you had to crawl or climb. Carbide was widely available back then, particularly in coal mining counties or near coal mining counties. And my favorite little carbide was a guy's dropper that was way in the back of a hardware store, I think in either Jacksboro or La Follette in Campbell County, and it sat way up on the top, and it was $2.50. And that lamp is still functional. It's had a lot of replacement parts, but it still works. Unlike auto lights, which we found would split at the seams. Just Right had replacement parts fairly available, fortunately. Later in life, I met an employee of Just Right in the Chicago area, but unfortunately, most of my caving had been finished by then, at least down in this part of the country. Now, Gerald Money, as you probably know, rates restaurants in little towns as carbide lights. One carbide light, too. I mean, if you get the 4 carbides, that's a pretty good place to eat. We had a similar scale, but not quite so elegant. We just had mapped out where the good ones were. And unfortunately, people retire, die, and ownership changes, and most of those are now gone. The Blaine Cafe up in East Tennessee along 11W was an excellent truck stop place to eat. It's an antique store now. The old Clinton Hotel in Clinton was an excellent family-style restaurant. And I drove up to that not long ago expecting a good meal, and all that was there was a pile of bricks and the lintel post. So our restaurant sets, I don't think, overlap at all anymore. But our methods were similar to what are used today, except we just didn't call them rated by carbide lights. Moonshine stills were fairly active back in those days, and I might mention a few incidents that we ran into. In Gizzard Cove Cave, the still was across a lake at the entrance, and you need a boat to get there, so the revenuers couldn't catch anybody very readily, unless they showed up with their own life raft or something. In Wolf River Cave, Roy and Bert and I guess, had been back spent several hours in the cave, and we came out the entrance. As you know, you clatter down to the stream level and then come clattering out and make a lot of noise. An entrance back then was a popular place to sit and cool off on the cave. We found 2 guys sitting there at the edge, and they looked sort of guilty. They were drinking water out of Coke bottles. And they had seen our state truck parked down by the road. They're kind of skittish. We might be revenuers of some sort. When we found out we weren't, then they offered us a sample. It turned out it was white lightning. And I think Roy was offended and went back to the truck. We figured we got a sample of it or else. And I have to admit it was very smooth. It had strong after effects. The more sophisticated methods produced a product called charter whiskey. It's named that because they use charred barrels to store it. And typically around Sewanee, they would bury the barrel somewhere in the back of the house, down the hall or somewhere, where the revenuers wouldn't find it. And just for small consumption, a few 100 gallons or so at a time. Fritz Weitzel, professor at Sewanee, used to have a friend of his who kind of made such a product and he would get a little pint from the guy every now and then. He named it, Fritz named it Old Covite, for the inhabitants of the coves. And of course, sophisticated techniques. This is what was used basically in sour mash and producing Jack Daniels and ultimately, what's that other upstart thing down there, George Dickel. I have to tell also about one story that happened at Sinking Coal, which had very active moonshine activities going on. It was all land owned by John Gantz down there, and he's very cooperative with cavers, but he liked to know a day or two ahead that you were coming. And then he was very cooperative, so go right ahead. One day we went down there and couldn't get him on the phone, and we figured, well, it's all right, we'll just go anyway. And we met a Jeep coming up the creek bed loaded down with 100-pound sacks of sugar. And they gave us some pretty dirty looks, but that was the extent of it. There was, however, a large still operating down as a lower sort of room entrance to Sinking Cove, not the part where you swim out, but on beyond, sort of dry shelter place. And we had an expedition, Bert and Roy, I guess, and Fritz Weitzel and I all went down in the state truck. And Bert had cut his foot a few days before in Nickajack Cave, so he didn't want to go in a wet cave. And said, well, I'll just sleep here in the truck, take a nap till you come back. So we were off to the upper entrance and came out several hours later. But to reconstruct what happened as best we could from Bert's mumblings, shortly after we left, a little Papiocan-like character came out of the bushes. And he and Bert started talking, and it developed. The conversation eventually turned to moonshine liquor. Bert allowed us how he enjoyed a little bit of that every now and then. And so they went back in the still, and there's a big jug sitting around, and they imbibed for I don't know how long. When we came out several hours later, Bert was totally out of it. We just had to throw him in the truck. And we drove around, and it was 3 days before he sobered up. And so I've had to reconstruct the story as best we could what he told us later. I guess those were the scintillating episodes that we ran into. Of course, Jack Daniels is a more sophisticated, it's the same process of charter whiskey, but more controlled. The only legal distillery in the state for many years. And we decided, we went there to visit the cave that is so famous for the spring water that they use in making the whiskey. And it turned out that Rieger Motlow was the proprietor and the state legislature and the county political boss and everything else. And so he was a very expensive individual. And Bert and I sat in his office and talked for a long time. And he said, you boys drink a little bit every now and then. We said, well, you know, a little. And so he brought out samples. They had free samples back in those days, although now Tank Gordon tells me all they had was tea and lemonade or something. But they had free samples in little bottles, and they didn't give us just one little bottle, but a whole box of little bottles. And so and Bert was out Roy was out in the truck, and they said, the other fellow drinks too, doesn't he? Oh yes, we'll take that. That night we sat out in the corner, bottles, pouring them in a ceramic lined canteen, I think. And, I ran across one of those up in Canada a couple of years ago, and it reminded me of that incident. But first we explored the cave, and we found the secret of the special flavor that they brag about, the spring water. About 1,000 feet back there is an immense pile of that water. And the stream divides and flows around the base of the pile and slowly dissolving it away at the base. and the bats keep replenishing it from the top. And there's still bats in there here. Harrison Steeves, an architect and caver in Birmingham, used to open a bottle and sniff it, says, smell that bat going on. But it's limestone water, alkaline water, and it seems to work very well for that particular product. Well, I think I'll leave moonshine for now, unless you remember, you weren't present for most of the episodes. You were in the truck, and we kept them a secret. Not to offend the sensibilities. Eventually, the book had to be written, of course. Fieldwork continued off and on. I was a year out of Texas Tech teaching, and that sort of suspended activities for a while. I sketched out parts of the book while I was out there, but when I moved back to Tennessee, we began again, particularly around Tennessee Tech, where I taught for a while. And we did a movie on the cave community, which was put out by Encyclopedia Britannica Films about 1960. They used to have a lot of little teaching films. And it was kind of didactic, but we had some good shots. And then there was a German photographer, newly immigrated to the United States from Germany, and Bert Van Bork. And this was his first film job for EBF, Encyclopedia Britannica Films. Recently, I contacted Bert again. He's living in Evanston, and he's even older than I am now. But we had a little tyrant of a director, and behind the director's back, Bert Van Borken, I would call him the Führer. The best shots in the whole film we made while the director had to go back to Chicago for a couple of days. We inspired him in his back. We borrowed a raccoon over from one of the neighbors, a pet raccoon, to show a raccoon going in and supposedly leaving scats behind to be eaten by cave critters and so forth. And the raccoon obligingly went into a little higginbottom cave and never came out. It was about 6 weeks later, Roy, somebody told me that the little children over on the far side down there Shallow Forward were in bed one day, and this raccoon jumps in the window and gets in bed with them. That was the long lost pet raccoon. Anyway, all of the field work led to final publication, and there's a guy named Bob Floyd who was the editor, and he set an arbitrary cutoff date. No matter how many new caves we were finding every day, after such and such a date, they would never find their way into the cave book. So a lot of known caves were left out for that reason. But it had to end eventually, and so the book would be edited and set in type. They used drafting services from TVA to touch up, make suitable a lot of the little sketch maps we had made. And Floyd did the burnt work of editing the thing. And eventually I got proofs back and was able to correct those. Some of the geology and the exact locations are probably incorrect because they would automatically assume that even though I had the stratum right geological formation correct, they would assume, well, at that location, 10 feet above, it has to be in Chattanooga shale or something like that. And so some of that is incorrect in the book. And as I've already said, some of the locations turned out to be poor or way off, as a matter of fact, because we had no maps or, at best, little 15-minute quads. Phil Hardiman and I had talked sort of informally from time to time about what we would name the book, and eventually the consensus would just be not Caverns of Tennessee or something. Bill Davies had used Caverns of Tennessee, I think, and it seemed a little high. highfalutin to us, so we just call it Caves, Tennessee. And eventually it was published as well in it was fall '61. Now we put in as many illustrations as we could. Both Roy and I were interested in illustrating the book with, you know, reasonable photographs of the cave interiors and so forth. And we each had little bitty Leicas in those days, 2Fs or 3Fs or something, I forget, which were very easy, very good cave cameras because they were so little compared to today's monsters. And Roy used a little hip pack, I think, for his, as long as he didn't go through too tight a crawling, it would not bother. And we had those collapsible tripods and so forth. And would shoot in the dark. You know. One person would control the cameras while the other flashed or whatever. In time, we developed the flash powder technique, and we've got it down pretty well pat. The films back in those days, Photochrom was about ASA 25, and we finally found that the best color balance, though, was with the Type A, and with an 81C for the flash powder at any rate. And usually we would, since we couldn't use slides in the finished book, color printing cost them so much back in those days, we often had several cameras at once. That was one old slide I debated whether I should show or not. I was standing up behind a row of about 4 cameras in, I guess it was Ward Cave in Bedford County. Shot the whole thing. And the reason we shot several cameras at once is because with flash powder you only get one chance. At least you have to wait a couple of days for all the smoke to clear out. So we tried to maximize the effect. Typically we would try 2 shots, front shot and a back one. And the technique, highly scientific, that Roy and I developed, he would go down the passage, and he had one of those 2 for a nickel notebooks. He would tear out a page and wedge it up on a ledge, using cave mud if necessary, or a little rock, and just pour out a guesstimate of flash powder. We knew about the approximate amount, about how much light we would get. And usually we'd shoot at about F8 or F11, because we had a lot of light being produced. I had one of the old-fashioned flash pans, which was a little gun, spring-driven gun. You pulled down on the thing and wedged the little knob in a groove. When you got ready to shoot, you just flip it out and it would bang into the bottom of the pan. And there were holes in the bottom of the pan where you would set a blank .22 cartridge, and you poured the powder on the top of that. So in order, you had to be careful that you didn't get smoke drifting into the scene when one from the earlier powder shot. So we usually waited, got all the cameras ready and opened them up. And Ward would light his charge. He might run out and be in the picture in the background also, but he would do the backlight. And so I got ready with my loaded spring gun, which is faster. And as soon as the backlight flashed, then I would hit the trigger and shoot the flash pan off. So that way we get 2 lights without smoke drifting through the scene. And I think we got pretty good results of that. The coverage is amazing. And then Eddie, as you've seen, has continued the similar techniques in his pit pictures. Anyway, we had as many photos as they would let us use in the book, which was not adequate, but were. Or I had an old roller cord I bought for about $50 down in Lower Manhattan, used camera store, and Roy had, I think, a speed graphic, or 2¼ yeah. We use that a lot, those big negatives, usually Tri-X on those. Anyway, Bulletin 64 of the Tennessee Division of Geology was published about, I think in the fall of '61. I was probably about 20, 21 or so when we started the field work, and it was about 30 by then. It was almost 8 or 9 years. So the whole project took much longer than Hardeman and I had envisioned at first. But as long as we were collecting good information, it could allow us to continue for a while. And I think we made the exorbitant sum of about $150 or $200 a month, plus I think 5 cents a mile, and when we didn't have a state truck, and about $2 a day expenses, something like that. But back in those days, a meat free in those country restaurants was about $1, $1.50. The really cheap ones were $1. The up and coming ones that trying to make a buck was $1.50, but it was fairly cheap. Motels about $3 or $4 a night. We tried staying at the Reed House. They looked at in Chattanooga, but they looked at our money clothes. We don't have any rooms. Anyway, Bulletin 64, and they went through. 3 or 4 years later, they went through. Decided to do a reprint, and they had lost all the plates. Fortunately, had saved the original illustrations and sent them back to them, and I don't think they may have returned them.